Hello and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. This time we're going to be talking about Mists of Pandaria, and basically my overview, my thoughts, and just some pros and cons about the expansion. Honestly, it was a very interesting expansion, actually, and I do have quite a lot to say about it. There is quite a bit in the negative, but there's also quite a bit in the positive. I think, they did a lot of things right, they did quite a few things wrong, but I'm actually very happy with how things are moving forwards into Warlords of Draenor, and just the fact that they've actually acknowledged quite a lot of the issues that I had with Mists of Pandaria, and that really does fill me with a lot of hope for the future. That kind of sounded cheesy, but anyway, let's just get right into the video and talk about the good. Mists of Pandaria really did do a great deal of good for the game. I think that's absolutely undeniable. Okay, I know, maybe, perhaps initially our subscribers dipped and some things like that, but I think there's a lot of good systems and gameplay changes that will benefit us in the future with Warlords of Draenor. So, first of all, in the good, the death of the Daily Hub. Well, I'm kind of glad this is gone. Honestly, hopefully, patch 5.4 will mark the end of the masses and masses of daily hubs that Blizzard started putting into the game, really with the Firelands patch. Okay, there's a few before that, like the Argent Crusade, Isle of Kel'Thas, but I think the Firelands was really major, and then just the start of Mists of Pandaria was a bombardment at all fronts, really. Now, actually, my problem is not, personally, it's not really with dailies at all. I think they're okay. The actual problem was that we were forced into them for gear progression at the start of the expansion. I have vivid and painful memories of just farming for Gulai Cache keys because I needed to get some leatherworking recipes so I could get gear, because I was a leather worker, and the reputation was just so heavily gated for the Golden Lotus faction. It was just painful. Now, it's probably worth saying that I'm actually okay with dailies, well, depending on how they're used. For an example, take Netherwing. I am still completely cool with Netherwing. Yes, there's dailies, yes, they're a bit grindy, but at least with, say, Netherwing, they were able to put in a decent bit of story and some interesting progression throughout that. And yeah, it was daily-based, but also it was completely optional, it was 4-mount, and it was fun. The only dailies that I really didn't mind doing were the Cloud Serpent ones, because I thought that was fine, because they weren't tied to gear progression, they were just completely optional, something you could do on your own terms because you wanted a thing, not something that you felt you had to do because you wanted to put out more numbers in a raid, and of course that is a completely valid thing to want. So yeah, the death of dailies, at least in the capacity of being an important part of early patch or early expansion gearing, I think that's definitely a great thing. The next good thing was actually the Timeless Isle. It's more dynamic and it's more exploration focused. Now, one little criticism of the Timeless Isle is that it is perhaps a little bit sparse. It's not ginormous, and you can blow through it in a relatively short amount of time, but still, I think that it's definitely the right direction to move. The player actually has some agency. You land on the island and think, well, I can kill these slightly harder mobs, or I can go here, I can go to the cave with Zarhim in it. You can go searching for some things like the Gleaming Crane statue, all that stuff. There was a lot more just sort of packed into that zone. And I think that if it was perhaps a little bit bigger with just maybe a little bit more content, then it would have worked perfectly. But still though, I do think it worked quite well. It had some cool rewards, plenty of varied bosses, lots of rare mobs to find, and I actually think that the Celestials and Ordos were pretty good. Especially Ordos, I like the way of having this kind of unique boss, and you felt like killing Ordos and getting a chance of that really, well, pretty nice loot was nearly a reward for all your hard work getting the legendary cloak, so I actually think that did work out quite well. Then, of course, we have Xiaohao, and you know what, Xiaohao was cool, but I would prefer if it was maybe just something other than grinding mobs, only grinding mobs, if there were maybe just more than that one daily quest that they gave you. I think, personally, Netherwing and then the Netherray people are probably my favourite model for just basically a mount-based faction, so I think that it could have been done a little bit better with Xiaohao, but I do like the idea of there being one of those ultra-rare, grindy mounts, the kind of traditional thing. It's okay for them to be smothered in there, or just sort of around the place. So yeah, overall though, I think when they just take this Timeless Isle idea and the dynamic content and all that stuff, when they take that forward into Warlords of Draenor, where it's going to be weaved through every single quest zone, and then weaved through all of the outdoor PvE content that we get in patches, I just think it'll work out great. Based on what they've said at BlizzCon, they also have got a treasure system where you can find unique little treasures around the place in the world to encourage exploration. And actually, getting those treasures in combination with the fact that we don't have flying mounts is going to be a bit more interesting because the terrain will also be a part of treasure hunting. So overall, Timeless Isle and that whole line of thought is, in my opinion, a great addition to the game. One thing that's probably worth mentioning, though, is it would be nice if there was a persistent storyline throughout the Isle that was similar to the patch 5.1 storyline that we got at Lion's Landing and Dominance Point. I thought they were very good, and it gave you a reason to go back every day to do that stuff. Of course, with the Timeless Isles, we did have the quests with Kairos Dormu, but they were, they weren't particularly as good in terms of the story front. So, let's move on with the list of good things. Heroic scenarios. Well, they provide a good bit of challenge, and they're in a very accessible format. Sure, it's not really that hard, but at least you do need to think a little bit, and overall I just think it was a nice addition to the game. It's the sort of thing you can just grab a few guildies, go do some content where you can do it maybe when you're not completely half asleep, and then jump out again. Now, of course, we all do overgear heroic scenarios, but when they were launched, they did require a little bit of thought, especially with this idea of there being a target time to beat, which, you know, would get you some additional rewards. I think that was nice, because even if you did overgear it a little bit, there was still a motivation to try hard and push on and try to do better. So that was a really, really great addition to the game, and I just hope that they do a better job of balancing where heroic scenarios fit into the overall gear progression in the future, and I'll talk about that when I move on to some of the bad points about Mists of Pandaria. So next, solid raids. I have raided in patch 5.4 and patch 5.2 for pretty much all of the patch, and then about 60% of patch 5.0. I mean, I have killed every single boss in 5.0, but I wasn't one of my guild's main raiders because I just came back to the game. Though that said, no, I have done 100% of 5.0 because I killed it all on normal before nerfs, I think. So yeah, that's cool. Anyway, I've really enjoyed all of the raids of Mists of Pandaria, perhaps with the exception of the Klaxi place because I just don't really like that aesthetic, but in general, the raids were really good. The boss design's also been very interesting, and I especially like their emphasis on personal responsibility. The great thing about that for encounter design is it just keeps you on your toes during the fights, and it prevents them from getting dull quickly. Because even if you do overgear it, well, there's probably something that you have to watch out for. Take Li Shen. That is a boss fight, which I think is just fantastic. Because even when we would just get a normal Li Shen kill, you know, bat of an eyelid, no effort at all, you still actually had to play the raid and pay attention to the encounter. You needed to move out of the static charges, move under the weird sphere ball things that fell from the sky. Sphere ball, that's completely redundant, but anyway, you know what I mean. I just think that basic idea was very nice to see in raids, and I like the way that they've said they'll be continuing to go down this route. Now, one little bit of criticism is I wouldn't mind there just being one, maybe just one patchwork boss every once in a while, or one of those kind of simple, relaxing bosses, because if you have a 14 boss long tier, and every single one of them is just OMG mechanics, then I think it can wear down on some people, and especially on a raid night, it can be a little bit more mentally exhausting. Still though, overall, a very, very solid expansion of raiding, and I'm very happy in that regard. So next we have challenge modes, for those who like them. Not really my cup of tea, but honestly a lot of people enjoy challenge modes. Well, at least some people enjoy challenge modes, which is fantastic. People get to do content that they like. It's outside the gear progression, so the whole, you know, like normalized gear and being focused on time trials doesn't really matter in terms of affecting the rest of the game. So overall, challenge modes, very good, great addition. Next thing we have is flexible difficulty. It gives you more choice, which is always good. And actually they removed ICC 10 difficulty and then didn't replace it in Cataclysm. So finally that section of the player base actually has content which will suit them. Then we have the arena. Now, I know that the arena isn't perfect and balance isn't perfect, but from what I have heard from PvP people, it's getting a little bit better. And from what Blizzard have recently said, they've actually had a large uptake in the amount of people who participate in arenas, especially in 3v3. Which is very exciting. That's nice to hear. So let's see, next we have the Chinese music, or at least that kind of Chinese-inspired music, which I really loved. I didn't like the rest of the expansion's music, but any of that really cool, sweeping Chinese-style stuff, I was absolutely into it, and it rests sort of nice and content on my iPod. Next, we have art. Now, I think the overall art for the expansion was quite pretty, bar a few zones, but I think what they did well was set-piece art. So just making one large cool thing. I actually am going to talk about the world design of Pandaria in a bit, in the negative section, because I think that it really did take away from a few of the really amazing set pieces that they made. So, yeah, that's the thing. Like, take, I don't know, the Jade Temple. beautiful looking thing, really well made, but it's, when you actually go there, it's, you know, covered in this weird marshy swamp thing, so you can't appreciate it. And, you know, think back to a zone that people love in a Grand. Really open, with some great vistas and really cool set pieces that you could appreciate because they weren't completely obscured all the time. Yes, so that's that little bit covered. Next, we have the Legendary Quest storyline. I think the storyline itself worked really well. It was nice to have a story play out during the end game, and it nearly provided a little bit of a side story to the main expansion stuff, which was all, you know, oh, Garrosh is going mad. Well, then you also have Rathian out on the side plotting and doing that kind of thing, so that was intriguing. The rewards were also rather cool in my opinion, though I would still like it if there was a traditional legendary item during the next expansion in addition to this. You know, just like Shadowmourne or something. Then next on the list of pluses, we have the Brawlers Guild. It only lasted a few evenings for me, but you know what? For those few evenings, I had fun. I had to play my class to the maximum of my ability at the time, and that's definitely something that you don't always have happen in a game. So that really was very engaging, and I'd love to see the Brawlers Guild just continue to be expanded upon in future expansions. So do that, Blizzard. Let's see, yeah, next, pet battles. I think these were a really nice distraction, actually. And there was a good period where I was just pet battling for my videos, for like the background footage, and I actually had a decent bit of fun. Okay, it was abstigation, but still, it was pretty good. It was easy to pick up, but it did have enough depth to allow for strategy, and I don't mean depth as in, oh, so deep and complex. It's just the way the abilities had very clear-cut, you know, this is good against flying, and the abilities just sort of had nice synergy between them, and I thought that was perhaps not, okay, maybe it's not depth, but at least it was engaging to play through. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's an ultra-important feature, but I think it's definitely one that was good for the game, and therefore, it gets a plus point in my kind of breakdown of Mists. So there's that, and then finally we have Connected Realms. They are still working the rollout of these, and they haven't affected me personally, but I'm certain that they have helped a lot of people, actually. So that's definitely very good. Now, that's just my main positive points. Just thinking through my head of things that really stood out to me. Of course, there are probably other things that will be good to different people and that I haven't mentioned, so if that is true, please leave it in the comments. I always do a follow-up video to these larger ones, and the purpose of that follow-up video is to highlight some of the intelligent stuff that people say, so if there was a feature that I didn't mention there that you liked, go ahead and tell me, and I will communicate what you said to all the viewers in the next, like the little follow-up thing. So, next we have the bad. Ooh. So, yeah, the bad, honestly, most of this is going to be me having a bit of a talk about quest design. It's funny, it's the kind of thing I nearly feel like I could write a damn thesis on, but editing it down to the sake of this video being maybe 20 to 30 minutes has been a little bit of a challenge, to say the least. So, yeah, let's just jump right into it. So first of all, I think that Blizzard actually mishandled the story of Pandaria. Overall, the tone was too light, and the Pandaren were portrayed as being quite whimsical. Now, I have no problem at all with a bunch of pandas doing martial arts, because honestly, all I care about is the martial arts, because you know what? Martial arts is badass. Instead of these guys being martial arts, like Shaolin-style pandas who are Pandaren, who are just really skilled and badass, they just made them too jokey, in my opinion. And it was really out of place, actually, because there's a lot of times in the game where they were actually trying to tell a really serious story with the Pandaren, and those stories, in a sort of insular perspective, were actually very interesting. But the sort of overall tone of the expansion in which it was set was it didn't really reinforce that. So that's the thing. And by the way, I do know that there has to be light points. For an example, there's actually some points of, say, Alfred Hitchcock's movies, which are often very dark movies, but there are elements which he would make a little, after he got the script, he'd make those elements of the story a little bit more light so they could emphasize the dark parts of the story. And I think that was genius in his films, but the thing is that it just didn't really work in Pandaria if that's what they were trying to do, and maybe by saying they were trying to do that, I'm giving them too much benefit of the doubt or whatever. So yeah, I just think overall the tone was very messy and incoherent, and that was just sad to see. Honestly, I wanted badass martial art people, because I find Chinese history and all that absolutely fascinating, and I just don't think we really got that as well as we could have. Now, this is actually something the Blizzard have actually commented on, and they said that they are going to be improving the tone for Warlords of Draenor, and they're going to bring it back and make it a bit more dark, because I think they've realized that the darker stories, or at least those which are a little bit more, just kind of, what's the word, they have more gravitas and that sort of thing, they seem to resonate better with players, so hopefully Blizzard do decide to do that. Anyway, then another problem is that for most of the quests, you are dealing with a faceless enemy. Oh no, the Shah have popped up again. The Shah, they appeared from the ground, and yeah, there was no character interaction here at all, and this didn't really give us a great villain to grapple with. Sure, you had Garrosh, who was responsible for the Shah appearing in the Jade Forest, but really after that you didn't see much of the Horde until the patches. Then you have the Klaxi, who were fine, but really they just sort of appeared seemingly randomly in two zones. I'm sure they were well established in the lore of Pandaria, but their actual in-game story wasn't too great. It was a bit like throwing a new villain right into the third act of a book that just kind of comes in, sweeps up the story of the old villain, and doesn't give you much sort of payoff for the old villain, which was rather strange. And yeah, by the way, I do know that while, say, the Shah of Fear is behind the Klaxi, once again, we never got any proper character interaction with this. Okay, we messed around with the Paragons of the Klaxi for a while, and some of those story elements were interesting, in regards to their affiliation with the old gods, but I just think that sort of in combination of all these different random faction things being thrown in, and then just to say that the spatterings of Mogu and then the random things that went on in the Valley of the Four Winds, it just wound up being very incoherent and effective. Sure, in another world, they could have had all of these different factions and races and had the exact same conflict going on, but through better quest design and zone flow, they could have woven that into a really nice, cohesive story. I just don't feel that they were able to pull that off in this instance. If they just had established a decent story arc and then had it follow a consistent quest structure with even the side points of the expansion sort of reinforcing a little bit of the main storyline, then it would have worked out better. I mean, when we landed, we found out about the Shah. Then we moved on to the Valley of the Four Winds, where we helped farmers and killed the odd Shah. Then we went to Conlai, where we fought Yongle, Shah, Trolls, Klaxi, and helped a bunch of farmers. Then in Taolong, we fought the Shah and Klaxi, and then in the Dread Wastes, we just fought mainly Klaxi. Karasang, oh, it has just completely left my head what we fought in Karasang. I'm pretty sure it was more Shah and a few Mogu. But as you can see, we're just jumping from enemy to enemy to enemy. But the main thing is that those enemies themselves were not particularly well fleshed out in terms of the in-game story, and their different storylines didn't really reinforce a common theme between all of them. Actually, let's just compare this to Northrend. So initially in Northrend, we were fighting forces loyal to the Lich King, either the Scourge or the Vrykul, and you knew the Scourge were fighting for the Lich King, obviously, but with the Vrykul, you were quickly told via a really cool questline that involved some personal character interaction with the Lich King himself. That was really interesting, and it gave a face to the enemy of the expansion, meaning the players were invested from the beginning. It was a good way to do a story. So anyway, then after that, if you were in the Howling Fjord, you find out a little bit more about what's going on with the Iron Dwarves and the Titans, and then in the Fjord, or not the Fjord, in the Borean Tundra, you find out a bit about the Nexus War. Then you get a main, so basically what you get in these two zones is a main Lich King storyline and then a side one. Then when we move into Dragonblight, we either face mainly the Lich King, but then also bits of the Nexus War. If we take, say, I don't know, the Sholazar Basin, it was pretty different, but we were all familiar with Helmut Nesingwary anyway, so that would have worked out because it was still tying into a storyline which we were already aware of. And then regardless of Helmut Nesingwary, we also did get to fight the Lich King and got some of the Iron Dwarf and Titan storyline in the Sholazar Basin. Then in Grizzly Hills, we got the Undead, the Iron Dwarves, and a bit about the Grizzlemaw. Again, both of these zones did new things, but they were grounded within the pre-existing story bounds of the previous zones that the players had been in. Take, say, Zuldrak. Now, I did not like Zuldrak, personally. I think it was a weak point of that expansion, but at least it was still grounded in Lich King lore, and there was plenty of relevant plot hooks. If you moved into Zuldrak right after Grizzly Hills, then you were already introduced to the zone's story in a really effective way. So, of course, I would just always skip Zuldrak and move right into Sholazar Basin, because I really like that place. But, yeah, that's how that played out. And then, finally, when you have fought through all those zones, you've been introduced to the Lich King, you've dealt with the Nexus War, kind of. I think the Nexus War was probably the one thing that just sort of popped out for some players, and that was perhaps a little bit of a criticism, but in general, though, you found out about the Iron Dwarves, you found out about the Lich King, and then your final option is, do I go to ICC or do I go to Storm Peaks? Both storylines and zones in which the players already invested, meaning that they actually care about them. If you like an Iron Dwarf story, then you go to the zone which is perfect for you, and same with the Undead and the Lich King. I think that was a really good way to do things. Did that happen in Pandaria? No. We found out about the Klaxi, we killed some of the Klaxi, and then we were at endgame. We didn't really deal with many Sha or Mogu, or it was just sort of weird and ham-fisted the way that all pulled together. So yeah, basically Wrath started by introducing enemy storylines, and then it tied them up into a sort of pre-ICC and Ulduar position by the end. In Mists of Pandaria, we started killing Sha and other random things in the Jade Forest, and then ended by killing Klaxi. There was a lack of cohesion there, and I believe that it really did hurt the experience, and it just made it kind of disjointed. Then, of course, there were also too many linear quest segments. For example, the Tolong Steppes really did step out in that regard. Oh, kill me now, that was a terrible pun. Anyway, so these sections were basically supposed to be there wholly for the purpose of story, and okay, the first time I played through those, I was like, okay, yeah, me and Taran Zoo are going to go get shit done. But the problem with that is that it meant that subsequent playthroughs of the story, well, in subsequent playthroughs of those zones, the story was gone and the slog remained. Not really the best quest design there. So actually, really, it all could have worked out quite well. The lore of Pandaria is pretty decent, and I think a better quest structure would have worked. The initial villain of the expansion was also the Sha, which is a problem because they were faceless and unrelatable, and far harder to care about that. I found Garrosh to be a far more compelling foe, and once they got his story into gear with patch 5.1 and then carried it through 5.3 and 4. So yeah, there we go. Then finally, one little point is that Pandaria was not really well established in the lore, not Lower Warcraft show, Chen Stormstout popping up in Warcraft 3 with the founding of Orgrimmar, and you know what, that was cool, but I think there was a bit of a problem in that how Pandaria needed to be inserted into some of the previous lore, because there wasn't much prehistory written before Mists came out, which was a bit of an issue. Say like not Nautland. Nautland doesn't exist. Outland and Northrend already had lots of notable spots and things like that were really well thought out and sort of defined in the Warcraft RTS games. This gave Blizzard a really good base, and then of course Cataclysm had the world, the old world go off. I don't think like Mists really had that. It was just kind of made, and I think they did a great job of making cool set pieces, but well, you know what, I'll talk about this in a minute when I talk about zones. So anyway, yeah, at least from a story perspective, Blizzard has partially seen the problem. They recently said that Warlords of Draenor will be returning to a more dark story. I hope this means less joke quests and more of a Wrath style of storytelling, at least in terms of tone. Now, of course, joke quests are fine in principle, and sometimes it's nice to have the humour contrast the dark points, but if the humour is overused and is not subtle, then it's just, it's ineffective. Subtle humour is often the best, the stuff that really makes you chuckle from deep within. And they just seem to rely on cheap gags, and that really is a little bit unfortunate. So anyway, now that we've talked about quests, let's talk about zone story. This will be quick. Basically, I don't particularly like the zone design. I think that the set pieces were often fantastic. People like, or places like the Temple of the Jade Serpent and, say, the actual mountains of Kunlai Summit. But the problem is, the surroundings came off as being rather bland to me. Dread Wastes and Talong Steppes just felt kind of dull and uninteresting, and then the beauty of some elements of, say, the Jade Forest were just masked in boring, swampy, misty areas. Then if we take Kunlai Summit, the actual peaks were amazing, but everything around that was just a browny orange colour, and that wasn't very interesting. Although I will say that at least the Temple of the White Tiger did stand out pretty well against all that, and it did look really cool, so yeah, it's a bit weird. Anyway, so number 3, daily quests. There's too many of them to start, burned people out, the gear progression was too heavily tied to them, and they also had a really bad, quest structure. A really bad quest structure. It was just like go from hub to hub to hub to hub and never stop. Which was, come on, you guys all know how painful that was if you played in 5.0. And, yeah, they also just designed the whole thing so that you need to do multiple sets of dailies per character per day. What if you want to have 2 characters relatively competitive? Well, back then, you would have to do all your dailies every day, nearly, on 2 characters. That's not something that I really envy anyone having to do. So that was the thing. Then, at number 4, we have easy heroics. Due to the heroic dungeons being made for fresh 90s, they were kind of outgeared too quickly. Previously, you would have to gear up to max level, or you would have to gear up at max level via the maximum level normals. But in Mists of Pandaria, heroics were basically intended to be used right after you ding 90. Maybe after 1 or 2 scenarios. Now this meant that the kind of gear level that these heroics would require, well, they had to be okay to do in questing gear. And I think that was definitely a bit of an issue, and it meant that, especially after a few weeks, there was not much engaging gameplay left. And then, so number 5 in the list of negatives is perhaps scenarios. Now, they do have some positives, but I don't think they panned out too well. Basically, I think that they ended up not really being that fun because they were just a mindless zerg, and unlike the heroic scenarios, there just wasn't much gameplay in them. If they were perhaps a tiny bit harder, I'd be okay with it. And honestly, I'd be okay with the gear progression being you ding 90, then you do some scenarios, then you do some normal dungeons, then you do some heroic dungeons, then you can move on to other things. I think that would have been a better way to do it, but it just didn't end up working out like that in practice, I suppose. Maybe that's what it's supposed to be like, it probably is, but I just don't think it really panned out too well. Anyway, so number 6, heroic, well, in my list of the negatives, heroic scenarios did supplant dungeons, and this was a little bit sad for me to see, actually. There was no reason to go back to heroics. 3-person is definitely very different from 5-person, so the heroic scenario doesn't really fulfill the same void that a heroic dungeon does. It's a very different dynamic, especially without the need of a tank, healer, or DPS sort of specific group with the scenarios. And that said, I still really did enjoy the scenarios. I'd more just say that they were both different bits of content, and it's sad that one of those different bits of content supplanted the other bit of content. So that was a bit of a pity. Anyway, so number 7 on the list is post-launch dungeons. Now sure, there were some problems about funneling people through the new dungeons in Cataclysm and maybe the End of Wrath, but Pandaria didn't start off with a great deal of new dungeons, and it also didn't add any. And basically this made one of the mainstay elements of World of Warcraft basically dead for the majority of the expansion, which is a real pity. Back at the end of Wrath of the Lich King, we got ICC and then 3 new high-quality dungeons all at once. ICC is my favourite raid in the game, and I love those dungeons. They were challenging, they were well-designed, and they were just damn fun. I thought it was great. Perhaps maybe Halls of Reflection wasn't as good as the others, but hey, whatever. I think they were all still pretty good. Now, this did take a lot of work, and it resulted in Trial of the Crusader, which was actually a filler patch, as even Blizzard have said. That's a pity, but now that the team is larger, I think that it would be possible to launch a new raid here that has a really nice big raid, and then also some new dungeons or something like that. And it does at least seem like Warlords of Draenor will see some post-launch dungeons, which is really good. Then coming in at number 8, we have LFR, and this mode does have a bit of an odd disparity with the mechanics. Basically, the mechanics were nerfed based on numbers, and this did make the fights rather easy, but because they were, well, basically it made them easy because it just cut the numbers, as I said. Now, those fight mechanics were only designed to work with the numbers being at a certain level, so when they were cut, it just meant that those mechanics felt half-baked and poorly designed, because they only half-worked, a little bit. Now, personally, I would actually prefer it if LFR bosses were made more simple in terms of complexity, but had the few abilities that they did have be a threat. That would mean that there is still engaging gameplay and that you must stand out of the fire or you will die. Like, there's still engaging gameplay there, but there's not the overwhelming complexity. Because honestly, I don't think the problem is that players cannot stand out of the fire or can't stack on a thing. I think the main problem is that a lot of players who are not used to raiding just see loads of things happening. They're worried about looking at their action bars and their DPS meter, which they shouldn't be looking at if they're not that good, but hey, that's a thing. They just get all this visual noise, and that's why they miss the fact they're standing in the fire and they die, or they don't pay attention on Duramu. Well, if some of those fights are a bit more simple, they'd be more readable, and that would work quite well for what I think LFR probably should be. So that's the thing. Anyway, at number 9, we have the Legendary Quest, and okay, the actual mechanics of the quest. Unfortunately, it forced people into PvP, and with those battlegrounds, and then it forced PvP people into PvE for getting the Valor, and I think that was really a poor decision. But Blizzard have learnt a lot from this. I don't think the next quest will be like this, and hopefully now that they understand how to make one that's better, the Warlords Legendary Quest will be, well, just far better. That would be quite nice. Then, at number 10, we have no Winter Grasp, or Tol Barad. Now, Winter Grasp and its associated bosses were actually extremely fun to me. It was a nice bit of at least weekly content to keep yourself busy with. You could always think, oh, great, Winter Grasp is in half an hour. I can go, I can kill some things, get in a siege engine, blast down a wall, go kill Archivon and friends, and I'll get maybe some gear or some points. That was fun. And that was gone in Mists of Pandaria, which really was rather sad. I am, though, glad to see that this is going to return in the form of Ashran in Warlords of Draenor. Then at number 11, we have menus, and this is just a general concern, but I'm a little bit worried that too much of World of Warcraft is going to be accessed via a menu rather than through the actual game world. This is very problematic for, just from a game designer's perspective. I think that it's best for games like this to be constantly reinforcing the world in which they take place. After all, it is the world of Warcraft. By having so much important gameplay accessed via menus does, I believe, take away from this to a degree. So yeah, that's a thing. Now, overall, basically, I do know that it did sound like I was railing on the expansion there, but I think it is important to highlight some issues so that they can be improved. And there's probably one or two things that I missed on both the good and bad sides there, so, of course, as I said earlier, do let me know in the comments, and I will feature you on the next video, which would be kind of nice. So yeah, and now another great thing is that a lot of my issues have already been acknowledged by Blizzard, which is fantastic. I have a lot more hope for the Warlords of Draenor questing experience, and I just really cannot wait to get my teeth into that expansion. So anyway, Mists of Pandaria was not the best expansion in my opinion, however I do think it was a bit better than Cataclysm. Personally though, I would rank Wrath of the Lich King as being the best, because I got to do Ulduar, a tiny bit of Trial of the Crusader, and a crap ton of ICC, and I loved, well, mainly Ulduar and ICC. And then I'd say Burning Crusade, because that is when I originally leveled up and played the game. I loved the leveling there, just more because it was a really cool alien world. I had my initial foray into PvP, a little bit of raiding in Karazhan, and that was really enjoyable. So then ranking in after Burning Crusade, we have Mists of Pandaria, and then at the very bottom, Cataclysm. So yeah, but overall, hey, World of Warcraft's a great game. And they're getting better. We recently had an increase in subscribers, which is just crazy awesome and great. So, you know what? I think things are looking on the up. And I did enjoy my time with Mists of Pandaria, especially the raid content, which I think was really fantastic. And Ian Hozakostas and his team of encounter designers or whatever are doing a fantastic job. But anyway, hopefully all these lessons will pay off in Warlords of Draenor, and we will get an amazing expansion. That is it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe because it really does help me out, and I will see you next time.